and welcome. We'll let people get settled in here. A couple folks still joining us. My name is Blair Taylor, and I am the program director for the Institute for Social Ecology, and we're very happy to have you all on this morning / afternoon or evening, wherever you happen to find yourself. We've got a characteristically global group, at least, who enrolled. About 200 people almost wrote, which I think speaks to the great interest in this topic and its timeliness, its relevance to the current moment, which is fantastic. Folks from South Africa, all over Europe, some folks in Asia, so a lot from North America. So welcome, everybody. The format for today, the talk obviously is conspiracy theory as a substitute for social critique. And it is going to offer an analysis by Dr. Peter Staudenmaier, a historian at Marquette University, of the current moment's explosion in conspiracy theory and try to historicize that a little bit, and especially look at the rise of conspiratorial thought on the left and in ecological movements. Peter did a variation of this talk in the late 90s at the Institute, and then in the early 2000s at the Institute, and it's been interesting to see the conversation evolve. And I remember at that time some of the pushback towards that, like, oh, aren't they kind of on our side? And I think here in the year 2021, there's probably far less defense, I would say, we'll see, of conspiracy thought, but it's certainly, unfortunately, as common now as it was then, if not more so. So Peter's going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, historicize, contextualize some of this, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion and conversation. Let me just let a few more people in here. If you are not familiar with the Institute for Social Ecology, I see a lot of familiar names. We are a popular education organization historically based in Vermont, and we offer events like this. We offer a bunch of different courses, online courses. We have a few starting in the next couple months. We have one called Commune, Council, Party, Marxism and Direct Democracy by Mason, Herson, Horde. That's a 10-week course on looking at the Marxist tradition from the lens of social ecology, grappling with questions of direct democracy and political strategy. And then in January, we'll be offering our food and climate justice course again. So with taught by Brian Tokar and Grace Gershuni. So be sure to check that out. Each week features different guest speakers from various frontline communities and movements. And it's a great course. Let's see here. Where are we? We are at 66 people. When we get to the conversation section, if first of all, folks could please keep your microphones muted, and also we are recording this. This will eventually go online, so if you do not want to be featured there, please turn off your camera. You can change your name, etc. We will edit this out at some point. If you want to get on Stack to get on the list to ask a question, we ask that at the end, if you could just raise your hand using the little icon or put a little asterisk here in the chat, and I will keep track of folks and we'll try to get through everybody as much as we can. One other plug I wanted to mention here is that Peter has a new book out on New Compass Press, which is a great social ecology press based in Europe, called Ecology Contested, Environmental Politics Between Left and Right. Peter is also a scholar of environmental history. He's working on a book on the project. He wrote the kind of classic, along with Janet Biel, Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience, which touches on some of these same themes, but looking at it from the perspective of environmental politics. So give it a read. It's a great little book. And I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Peter Staudenmaier, who, as I briefly mentioned, is a historian, professor of history at Marquette University, teaches on environmental history. He specializes in modern European world history, especially fascism in Germany and Italy. And he's been a staff member, faculty member at the Institute for Social Ecology for a very long time. And thanks so much, Peter, for doing this talk. It's really timely and important. So looking forward to listening.
It sure is. Thank you, Blair. And thanks to everybody for being here. This really is a very large turnout. And I think Blair's right that it tells us something. The Institute for Social Ecology has been working for several decades now to try to offer critical perspectives on the persistence of conspiracy thinking and of conspiracy theories in society at large, and also in the radical social movements that many of us are part of. And even though we've been doing that work for a long time now, it seems to me that the turnout for today, the number of you all who have come to join us for this discussion, I think that really speaks to the tenor of the times. I think Blair was exactly right to note that we are living right now through a historic revival of conspiracy thinking across the political spectrum, not just on the left, not just on the right, and across different parts of the world, not just in the United States, where I happen to live, where some of my comments will focus on, but in many different parts of this planet. And a lot of people have been working hard the past few years to try to comprehend that ongoing resurgence of conspiracism. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not just the pandemic that has brought conspiracy theories out in force. Once again, I agree that's certainly an important part of the phenomenon, but I think that the longer term trends are equally important. To choose just one example, the rise of social media over the past, let's say, decade and a half, and the extent to which a social media environment governs the access that millions of people have to information about the world, that has changed what is at stake in debates about conspiracism as a form of thought, or conspiracism as a mindset or a worldview, or however we want to term it. So apart from the political trends of the last decade, which are also extremely important, the era of social media has amplified and heightened the long-standing predilection for conspiracy narratives as an explanation for periods of social crisis and uncertainty. And now, because of the pandemic, we find ourselves in an especially acute period of social crisis and uncertainty. And that means we are, in effect, we're facing a perfect storm of conspiracy beliefs that seem to draw in ever larger groups of people, hence the timeliness that Blair referred to a moment ago. But even as the appeal of conspiracy thinking seems to be growing exponentially, we also have more and more critical tools to help us make sense of it. And I'm going to try to draw on a range of those resources in my remarks today. Blair mentioned that I've given versions of this talk before, a long time ago in some places in the 1990s and the aughts. I think the most recent one was at Left Forum in New York City in 2007. So quite a while ago now. And like Blair, I would say that the pushback that I received, that those of us who are trying to put forward a critical analysis of conspiracy thinking from a left perspective, at that time, the pushback that we got was often fairly intense. A whole lot of other people involved in radical movements for social change, at that time at least, were drawn to, sometimes strongly drawn to, conspiracist ways of thinking. And they were displeased to hear a fundamental critique of conspiracism from the left. And I sometimes wonder, Blair raised this question too, I sometimes wonder if maybe some of those folks have changed their minds since then, after the meteoric rise of the far right, after the emergence of things like birtherism and Pizzagate and QAnon, after 4 years of a president here in the United States, where I live, a president who was the walking embodiment of credulousness towards conspiracist rhetoric and who openly promoted conspiracy myths while he was in office. I wonder if some of those folks have now shifted their position. I'm not sure. Maybe we'll eventually find out. In any case, from my point of view, now that the historical context has shifted in some profound ways, I think it is time to revisit that long-standing left critique of conspiracism, or I should say left critiques, plural, of conspiracist thought. And unfortunately, the terminology that we use in this context is always controversial. There simply still is no shared vocabulary that both critics and defenders, if you will, or proponents of conspiracy thinking, there's no shared vocabulary that we can agree on, at least so far. Do we refer to conspiracy theory? That's the term that we decided to use for the title of this presentation. I'll sometimes use that term in my remarks today. Do we refer to conspiracy ideology? Do we refer to what some observers have called the conspiracist imaginary? None of those terms is going to be acceptable to everybody. But for what it's worth, concepts like conspiracy thinking and conspiracism are not nearly as nebulous and ill-defined as some people believe. There is a sizable body of scholarship on this subject from a really wide range of disciplinary perspectives. Sociologists, philosophers, historians, psychologists, journalists, and many other people have studied this phenomenon in depth. And I think the rest of us can draw on that scholarship carefully and critically and try to refine our own approach to the topic and make our discussions of it more informed. Whatever we think of the findings that these various scholars have come up with, the extensive range and the depth of the research, the diversity of the research that they have done, it shows us that it is possible to use the term conspiracy theory as much more than a mere epithet. It's not just a term of abuse. The term has meaning, and we can argue about its multiple meanings. It doesn't have just one meaning, there's a bunch of meanings. Okay, for at least some of you here, this is not a theoretical discussion. Some of you have surely had to face this issue head on in your personal lives, in your political lives, maybe in both. Let's say that you know somebody through the social movements that you are involved with, somebody who goes to demonstrations or signs petitions or maybe shops at the local food co-op or hangs out with other progressives, whatever it is in your social circles that would be a stand-in for this person is on the left. You know that person, and you know that that person has a long-standing susceptibility for conspiracy theories. And then one day you hear them repeating far-right talking points or speaking up for fascists or asking us to give a fair hearing to Holocaust deniers, and so on and so forth. When things like that happen, it may seem shocking, but unfortunately, it isn't really surprising. Conspiracy thinking is and has been for decades a classic avenue for exactly this sort of left-right crossover. And that's one of the elements that I'm going to try to excavate a little bit today. So from my point of view, that is one of the biggest problems with what I would call the naive notion that conspiracy thinking is a form of oppositional politics or a form of resistance to authority or a form of popular counter knowledge, dissonance knowledge, as some of its supporters and defenders sometimes call it. In a society like ours, opposition can just as easily be reactionary rather than emancipatory. It can just as well come from the far right as from the left. It can just as well point toward a more hierarchical and authoritarian society rather than a more democratic, more participatory, more egalitarian society. And the title of my presentation today is grounded in that insight: conspiracy theory as a substitute for social critique. I want us to consider the contrasts between standard versions of conspiracy thinking and what I'm calling radical social critique. And I want us to look at the ways that conspiracy theory often tends to displace social critique and in some cases forms an obstacle to meaningful social critique. For those of us who are working towards a world beyond capitalism and beyond the nation state, the popularity of conspiracist beliefs, whether that's today or 5 years ago or 5 years from now, that popularity constitutes a serious challenge, one that I think we need to face squarely. But we also need to recognize that left versions of conspiracism are not a standalone phenomenon. They are a symptom of a deeper problem. And I would say that that deeper problem often comes down to the enduring appeal of simplistic and superficial explanatory frameworks among significant parts of the contemporary radical scene. Because more complex frameworks can seem forbidding and are often more conceptually demanding, because of that, we sometimes fall, and I mean we. I know that I'm speaking as the critic here, but I've been around for long enough that I myself have fallen into these same dynamics enough times in my life. We sometimes fall for facile slogans instead. If the complex theoretical frameworks seem like they're too much for us to make sense of, it can be tempting to fall into a slogan like follow the money, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or what have you. And we then convince ourselves that those sorts of ideas, which I'm calling simplistic and superficial, those ideas somehow pose a genuine threat to the social status quo, and that they will in fact rattle the very foundations of an unjust society. But they won't. That's the heart of my argument here today. A slogan like following the money, in my view, is a shallow way of trying to make sense of modern capitalism or the modern nation state or the basic social relations that underlie current systems of domination and of exploitation. And as long as we keep falling for slogans like that, we will remain susceptible to the false promise of conspiracy thinking. But the problem actually goes even deeper than that. Conspiracy thinking itself is a distorted expression of the alienation that capitalist and statist societies continually produce. The notion that we can critique it is important, but we can critique it all we want. Conspiracism as such is not just going to go away because somebody other pointed out that its basic ideas don't stand up to scrutiny. That's not going to do the trick. The only way we will ever truly overcome conspiracism as a whole is to create a radically different society. And until then, since I'm not about to suggest ways to magically do that right here and now, until then, I think we need to try our best to come to terms with the persistence of conspiracy beliefs and make as much sense of them as we can. To do that, I want to look at this subject of conspiracy thinking from two different directions. I want to look at conspiracy theories as a form of knowledge and as a form of politics. Let's start with the knowledge part. At bottom, conspiracy thinking is an inversion of critical thinking. In the topsy-turvy world of conspiracist thought, skepticism turns into credulousness. What starts out as a refusal to take anything at face value becomes a willingness to embrace utterly groundless beliefs, all in the name of free thinking. Free thinkers is one of those terms that the people I am calling conspiracists sometimes prefer to apply to themselves. And I would say that part of that process, part of that phenomenon, has to do with what we might call the Wikipedia effect. There is something about online cultures, unfortunately, that seduces us into believing that all of the world's information all of the world's knowledge is readily available at our fingertips, right here on our keyboards, just a click away, immediately accessible, ready to be consumed and shared. But often that is kind of the opposite of how actual knowledge is generated. That tends to happen through painstaking work, critical analysis, systematic scrutiny, debate, revision, and so forth. At a more fundamental level, The very model of knowledge that animates much of the conspiracy scene is strikingly simplistic. It is driven by the conviction that everything is explicable with no untidy loose ends. It's a model that does not take heed of the limits of human knowledge and the limits of explanation. It cannot accept gaps and fissures and holes in our understanding of reality. Conspiracism wants to connect all of the dots. From a conspiracist viewpoint, those dots have to be connected because events are, in their view, premeditated and masterminded from above. This is an approach to knowledge that does not account for contingency. That's an important word and a term that I'll be using. We can try to explore it a little bit in a minute. It's an approach to knowledge that does not recognize that in a highly complex social system, there is enormous room for unpredictability, for unexpected occurrences, for things that happen that are not planned and that can't be traced back through a causal chain of intentional, conscious, deliberate actions. But many conspiracists, in my experience, can't even conceive of things like contingency and coincidence as a fundamental aspect of reality. For better or worse, we don't live in a universe that is structured around certainties and designs and programmed outcomes. We live in a universe that is propelled by contingent events, by irregular and unforeseen developments. And in that kind of universe, I would argue, intellectual humility is what is called for, being modest and reasonable about what we can and cannot know about the world. In stark contrast, many conspiracy theorists insist that there must be an adequate explanation for every detail of any event, and that explanation must center on purposeful and deliberate actions. From that perspective, any loose ends or dangling details or unexplained features are prima facie evidence of conspiracy and cover-up. And that is a version of knowledge that is built, sometimes implicitly, built on assumptions about cause and effect as straightforward processes, as primarily a matter of intentions and plans. And those are assumptions that are in turn based on what you might call a clockwork model of social reality. And the problem is that cause and effect very frequently are indirect when we can even establish causes in the first place. Sometimes we can't establish causes. And very often that process of causation is not a matter of intentions or motives or of deliberate activities and their consequences or of premeditation and planning. Most of what happens in the world is not premeditated or planned. Conspiracy thinking, from that point of view, represents a failure to recognize the general disorderliness of life. And that, in my view, is a severe failing. The reason conspiracy theorists can never connect all of the dots is not because of a cover-up, it's because the dots weren't connected in the first place. Social reality is not like a clockwork. It's not a straightforward process of cause and effect. Social reality isn't straightforward. It's messy, it's contradictory, it's erratic, it's ambiguous, it's unpredictable. It is not driven primarily by calculated actions and outcomes. In fact, I would suggest that the notion that, or the myth that social reality is driven primarily by calculated actions and outcomes, I think that stems in part from free market propaganda, from the ideologies that capitalism tends to wrap itself in, and the individualism that underlies such notions make that myth particularly powerful in US contexts, even in radical circles that consider themselves opponents of capitalism. And that brings us to the second thing that I want to look at today, conspiracism as a form of politics. A lot of the existing research on that question is beholden to liberal assumptions and often has conservative implications. And that's a problem. That doesn't make that research useless, but it does mean, I think, that we need to be attentive and self-reflective if we're going to draw on it to make sense of our current situation, as I think we should draw on some of that research despite its own shortcomings. But radical theorists can also develop our own critical analyses of the problems inherent in conspiracy models of the world without falling into the trap of defending current structures of power. From a radical left point of view, the problem with conspiracy theories is not that they are a threat to the status quo. The problem is that they are not a threat to the status quo. In fact, that they often effectively help shore up the societal status quo by diverting attention from its institutional structures. And in that sense, conspiracy theories distort and obscure the very power relations that they mean to reveal and explain. Thus, conspiracism, you might say, to go back to my title and sharpen it a bit, conspiracism offers a poor substitute for social critique, and it gets in the way of efforts to figure out how our society came to be the way it is and how it can be made different. The typical focus for many conspiracy theories is on spectacular events, famous incidents or infamous incidents, prominent individuals, all of what I would call the surface level phenomena of a deeply distorted society. But the worst crimes of the current social system are not the spectacular events that garner media attention. They're much more mundane. The everyday workings of capitalism, the normal functioning of the state, the ordinary mechanisms of race and class and gender that keep the current system going. A conspiracy conception of the social world does not help us understand those factors, much less change them. In contrast to conspiracy frameworks, a systemic critique of modern society tries to look at the logic of social systems. We can try to do that. We won't always succeed, but that's the idea behind a systemic critique. We try to look at the logic of social systems like capitalism or the nation state or white supremacy, and not just at the actions of particular individuals or groups. With extremely complex systems like contemporary capitalism, a focus on individuals or groups is not going to get at the root of the problem. The structural logic of capitalism is independent of the intentions or actions of any group and of any individual, whether it's the bankers or the bureaucrats or the billionaires, whether it's Bill Gates or George Soros or Hillary Clinton or anybody else. I want to share with you a quote that I've sometimes used in previous versions of this workshop. It's a quote from Theodor Adorno. Some of you will surely know who he was, famous Frankfurt School thinker. Adorno himself has now become the object of a conspiracy theory, the so-called cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. In the late 1930s, Adorno, who by that time was in exile from Germany, where he was from because he was Jew, he was a leftist, he was an intellectual. In the late 1930s, Adorno was trying to come to terms with this same conundrum that I'm asking us to face squarely. And what he reasoned was that when people encounter what he called, let me read you the quote here, when people encounter, quote, the impenetrable mystery of the processes of society, he reasoned that all too often we reach for reassuring but specious answers. And Adorno continued, whenever institutionalized social relationships appear as the work of hidden conspiracies, he warned, it has inevitably reactionary consequences. End of Adorno quote. I think we can update that insight for today, whether we're looking at the proliferation of pandemic conspiracies or others, wherever we find ourselves on this planet. The society that we live in is built around extraordinarily complicated, multidimensional frameworks of power with conflicting internal dynamics. And we have a choice about how to confront a society like that. We can fixate on a global power elite and its covert machinations, or we can critically examine the overt operations of global capitalism, for example, of an international economic system that is defined by inequality and is upheld by a constellation of rival nation state and non-state actors. All of that adds up to an intricate and multifaceted world system in which elites come and go. Continually, elites come and go without leaving much of a meaningful impact on the underlying structures, the institutions, and the basic dynamics of that global system. So the argument I'm trying to ask you to consider today is that sort of social system cannot be reduced to a cast of devious characters who are working behind the scenes, secretly conniving to deprive the rest of us of our rightful share. And when conspiracists nonetheless invite us to do just that, to reduce that social reality down to a much simpler tale of bad people doing bad things, when they do that, they are perhaps unwittingly invoking some of the most regressive strands within modern political history, above all the traditions of right-wing populism. And this raises one of the more challenging facets of the current upsurge in conspiracy fervor. People involved in conspiracy milieus tend to see themselves as anti-authoritarian, as the brave few who are willing to stand up against the official story and not just believe everything they're told and so forth. That's a very real component of the scene. You can tell from how I'm presenting it that I'm deeply skeptical of that self-perception, but it's important that we recognize this is how a lot of conspiracists view themselves. Unfortunately, they all too often end up falling for an emphatically authoritarian model of society, not an anti-authoritarian model of society, but an authoritarian model of society. Perhaps the most striking current example is QAnon. Subcultures like QAnon typically coalesce around authoritarian values, in this case, around an openly authoritarian political figure. And they prefer to cast themselves as resisting unjust authority. But what they're actually doing much of the time is replicating a series of deeply authoritarian social practices, ones that fit seamlessly into traditional forms of hierarchy, discipline, obedience, and so forth. That is an authoritarian social program, not an anti-authoritarian one, whether it is recognized as such or not. So for conspiracists and for authoritarian populists alike, very often the identification with a leader who is perceived as strong and powerful, whether it's Trump or somebody else, that identification with a supposedly powerful leader, it is supposed to overcome the experience of actual powerlessness that is inherent in a society structured around domination and dispossession. That is how QAnon has managed to evolve into what we might call a participatory conspiracy theory. I really want those of us on the left to start taking this part of QAnon seriously. QAnon gets people involved. It gives them a sense of collectively searching for the truth. It conveys a sort of feeling of, an exciting feeling of community. It's not just a substitute for social critique. It's a substitute for democratic participation. And in a society that otherwise excludes most of us from meaningful engagement in politics, that kind of surrogate participation, that kind of pretend participation can have a very powerful appeal. Okay, I want to close. I'm getting close to my end now. I want to close with A few reflections on what all of this might mean for emancipatory social movements, for efforts toward direct democracy, for alternative social practices that are rooted in freedom and equality, for people who are dedicated to creating a new society. And I'm going to guess that's a lot of the people who came to an Institute for Social Ecology event today. For people who are dedicated to trying to create a new society, it is essential to understand the differences between radical social critique and the counterfeit critiques that circulate within the conspiracist milieu. Conspiracy theories not only let the dominant institutions of our society off the hook, they let us off the hook as critics of those dominant institutions. They offer seductive but false answers to real questions, to important questions, to vital questions that everybody in our society eventually has to face. We are not living up to our own commitments as leftists, as activists, as participants in social change movements, as long as we're willing to settle for conspiracist explanations. So, why does conspiracism, given everything that I just said, why does conspiracism still find admirers and supporters on the left? I think part of it has to do with a disinterest in, and sometimes a distrust toward, complex theoretical frameworks, which I think is understandable. Part of it has to do with misunderstood mythologies of capitalism and the nation state. Part of it has to do with the seeming impenetrability of social life as such. And that's maybe the real root of the problem here that we need to look at. The starting point for conspiracy thinking, after all, is the fact that many aspects of the society that surrounds us, many aspects of that society do in fact seem incomprehensible, because they are incomprehensible, and they will remain incomprehensible if our only tools are conventional arguments and establishment ideas. But the history of the left, and I would say especially the history of the anti-authoritarian left, the history of grassroots social movements from below, the history of participatory democracy, of revolutionary efforts toward liberation, all of those histories provide us with a remarkable variety of alternative tools. When the social world seems inscrutable, when it seems like we cannot possibly make heads or tails any basic sense of it, we have the option of drawing on some of those tools to try to make better sense of our current predicament and start to move beyond it. So, in that spirit, let's see if we can take the title of my presentation for today and turn it around. If conspiracy theories are all the rage these days, we have a chance to replace those thoroughly inadequate theories with creative and responsive social critique. So it doesn't just have to be conspiracy theories as a substitute for social critique. We could flip that backwards and say, how about we start offering social critiques as a viable substitute for the ongoing appeal of conspiracy theories? In that sense, what radical social critique offers us is a genuine alternative to conspiracism, a critique that focuses on social structures and institutions, that looks at how those forces interact with one another and how they intersect with our personal lives, a critique that pays attention to historical change, a critique that takes theoretical work seriously and recognizes it as a necessary complement to the hands-on practical work that we all do, to our activism, and so forth. The more experience we can get with those things, the better we get at putting that sort of radical social critique into practice, the less appealing conspiracist approaches will become. Thank you so much for being here. I am looking forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Peter. a lot to chew on, and there's been a lively discussion going on in the chat here.
Which I've missed entirely. Sorry, I'll try to catch up on that.
Well, one maybe that we might start with that I think is useful or productive, that was way up there a ways, was basically some people were asking for a definition. How would you define a conspiracy theory? And also, how do you distinguish this from things that, well, the terminology itself gets contentious, but that some would describe as a conspiracy, such as the Mont Pelerin Society's plan to, propagate neoliberalism, things like this. How do you distinguish between semi-coordinated elite action and conspiracy?
Excellent. Do you want me to go ahead and tackle them one by one, or should we collect a few questions in a row? What makes the most sense?
Why don't we start there, and I will gather some. I will put together a list here.
I can do that. The definition question is an excellent question. I have to confess, in part because of my own disciplinary background. I'm a historian, as Blair mentioned a while ago. In part because of that, I don't always go first to definitions. I'm skeptical. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a sociologist, for example. In fields like in some versions of sociology, definitions are absolutely essential. You can't do your work without a good definition. Historians aren't really like that a lot of the time. We tend to go and look at what are people actually doing under whatever label we decide to attach to them. Nonetheless, it's a fair question what my definition of conspiracy theory might be. I tried to smuggle that in to the first half of my presentation when I was trying to delineate what I see as conspiracist models of knowledge. So if I had to boil it down into a definition, I would say a conspiracy theory is an account of some aspect of social reality that essentially is based on a series of conscious and deliberate actions that are happening somehow or other behind the scenes. We'd have to actually argue about what the hell does that mean, behind the scenes? That's a little vague. And that somehow has damaging effects on the social world. That's the important thing. Conspiracy theories don't coalesce around welcome events, around beneficial events, about things that we want to see happen in the world. Conspiracy theories coalesce around things that are perceived to be deleterious and somehow damaging to something that we, whoever we is, treasures about social reality. So that would be my best stab at a definition of a conspiracy theory. It is worth pointing out, and I just realized I did not point this out today. I went to the trouble of pointing this out in my 2007 and 2004 and 1999 presentations, and I totally forgot to do it. It is worth pointing out that there are, obviously, actual conspiracies in history. That's real. So it is possible. You might have noticed that my definition of conspiracy theory did not include the plank that they must be false. They don't have to be false. Sometimes a conspiracy theory, at least conceivably, could be more or less accurate. I find that to be rare, but it's not completely impossible. And for what it's worth, just to add on that a little bit, there's a strong sense in the conspiracist milieu that there's some sort of fundamental divide between their alternative stories, their alternative storylines, their narratives, and what they call the official story. And I'm not even objecting to the notion of an official story, but the problem from my point of view is a lot of the time, the official story itself is a conspiracy. I think we need to recognize that. If we're critics of conspiracy thinking, I think some of the conspiracy thinkers or the free thinkers or the independent researchers, as they like to call themselves, I think they need to recognize it too. The classic example is September 11th. Whatever you make of September 11th truth and all that stuff, the official version, the official story of what happened that day is a conspiracy. A relatively small group of people who sure the hell were working in secret. They didn't go and tell the passport office, hey, we're going to go to flight school in Florida so we can fly a bunch of planes into buildings. It was a conspiracy. That's the official version. So I am skeptical of attempts to try to draw a hard and fast line between alternative conspiracy models and the official version, which could never, ever, ever include a conspiracy, because that isn't true. The question about things like the Pellerin Society, things like, I don't know what to call them. A think tank seems a little harmless. Groups of private intellectuals and individuals, and sometimes very powerful people and economists and what have you, who take it upon themselves over a period of decades to promote a particular ideology. For what it's worth, I don't really see that as a conspiracy, because it strikes me as more the kind of thing you would expect in 19th and 20th century United States and Great Britain and continental European societies. There are strong institutional inducements or encouragements that if you want to come up with a new way of thinking that you want to encourage a bunch of people to eventually adopt, it might make sense to first start doing that in a smaller circle. It's not really so much secret as more private. Those are private associations that eventually try and sometimes succeed in having long-term public impacts, changing the nature of the public discussion. So I think it's very worth examining how that came to be. I have a great book on my shelf about that exact topic, and I've suddenly forgotten the author's name. Maybe one of you out there knows about it. Those things are very much worth studying. I don't think they really map particularly well onto what I have been trying to call a conspiracist model of social reality.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So let's take, I've got a couple different chunks of questions and questioners, and even though we're at almost 70 folks, I think we can probably take some time to actually hear from the folks. So if we could get questions, and we'll take them in 4, and then you can answer them and try to maybe find some commonalities from Haya, Laura, Abby, and Anne. Haya, you want to start us off?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Peter. That was amazing, as usual. I just want to say, we did our panel like 3 weeks ago about the conspiracy theory, the anti-Jewish conspiracy theory, and Abdullah Öcalan's book, The Sociology of Freedom. And, Blair and you and me worked for many months to put together a reflection piece that I'll put in the chat. And we did a panel that I'll put in the chat as well. What's striking to me as I was listening to your talk is that almost, I'm not going to say all, but most conspiracy theories have an anti-Jewish element to them. So 9/11, people believe the Jews brought those towers down. You can go on, look at one conspiracy theory after another. Some are simply anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, but some are like the pandemic is caused by Jews. The climate crisis is created by Jews. So it's a theory of everything that white nationalists, as we know, are weaponizing. That's very, very dangerous. So, but I also want to say, you were saying that often it's used in place of a leftist theory of everything. So in the case of Öcalan, right, he is critiquing, what he calls capitalist modernity. So he's critiquing capitalism and nation states, and he's critiquing power accurately, but he's also sliding in with that a conspiracy that Jews have played a major role in creating these terrible social ills. And even though it's trying to become public that he wrote this material in his section called Jewish Ideology, the translator, the editor, the people who promoted the book, circulating the book, nobody, not one leftist organization will take this conspiracy down or address it. And I want to know, why do you think that is? Why, when the conspiracy theory is right in our movement, right in our faces, why are people afraid to do that? And I'll put the links to our panel and our statement in the chat.
Thanks, Haya. Why don't we hear from Laura and then Abby next?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for that very, very interesting, insightful lecture, as always. So the first thing I wanted to say is just to thank you for bringing up this very important message. I think that all of us can be susceptible to this type of thinking. And it is really hard to draw that distinction, especially when you are aware of things like the Mont Pelerin Society or the neoconservatives who literally would try to put out false information to manipulate the public into thinking things that were literally not true. And, the more you know about that, the more prone you are to starting to fall into this conspiracy theorist way of thinking. So I really appreciated that. I really appreciate you bringing up the issue of humility. I feel like there needs to be a lot more humility all around. Humility on the conspiracy theorist side, but also humility on the liberal side, because there's this very, big tendency for liberals to kind of dismiss these conspiracy theorists as just, they're just idiots, ha ha ha, all of this. So I really appreciated all of that. My question actually has to do with now I'm going to sound like the conspiracy theorist, but my question has to do with the origins of the COVID denialism. There was a report that came out, I don't know if you saw it, from the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right, that basically said that actually all of, or quite a bit of this information that was coming out that was seemingly medical, saying COVID is not serious, it's not real, all this sort of stuff actually was in some degree being put out by some Russian propaganda meisters. So specifically, they named Alexander Dugin and Vladimir Surkov. And, it was very interesting to me because I was delving into that after I read that report. And they were saying that they were actually targeting the anti-imperialist left with this propaganda. And of course, that this had to do with global geopolitics. So, there was much more to it than just what it seemed on the surface. And also that, Surkov and Dugin, that they kind of had this concept from the latter part of the Soviet Union, just before it fell, this whole idea of truth becoming subjective, that people had been lied to so much by that system that it just became like, there was no such thing as an objective truth. All truth was subjective. All of it was up for debate, and that they were intentionally manipulating that to cause fracture and to cause all of this unrest within the US, to kind of bring that down in much the same way that the US will intentionally back different factions and cause infighting and bring a country down and then gain control over them that way. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think about all of that.
Okay, so why don't we take questions from Abby and Anne, and then, is that good, Peter, or is that too much? So Abby?
Hi, so I'm currently getting my master's in library science, and I've noticed that like the discourse in my program regarding this type of stuff is that we need to guide people to correct sources or more scholarly sources. And I think that's treating a symptom and not, the cause. So I'm wondering if you had any advice for information professionals dealing with this type of stuff in their work, and what kind of how to explain the interdisciplinary reasons that these are, becoming so popular with people who have never really done the search themselves, for, where our social status is right now.
Thanks, Abby. And then Anne was on stack, and then we'll let Peter tackle these.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Anne.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. It's so important and appreciated. I was just wondering, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but I was just wondering if you could please expand on the link you mentioned between wanting things to be predetermined / to have a non-cause and free markets and capitalism. Yeah, all right, thank you.
All right, Peter, I think that's our chunk of 4. So if you want to.
My cue. Okay, thank you. These are tremendous questions. Oh my gosh. I will try to be relatively brief. Chaya's question is wonderful. And I go back and forth on my answer. I think I I don't remember exactly, but I think at one of my 1990s versions of this talk, I think I probably said something very similar to what Chaya said. I think I probably claimed that at least in Western contexts, the ones that I know well, the ones that I study, European and European-derived contexts, conspiracy theories virtually always end up at some point invoking anti-Semitic motifs. They almost always end up somehow anti-Semitic. And I don't know if that's true at this point. The more exposure I've had to some of the wackier stuff that's out there right now, if anything, I am sometimes struck by the absence of even implicit and sort of, just barely between the lines, references to Jews or Jewishness. Obviously, there's lots of examples of the latter. I was muted when Chaya was asking her question, but I mentioned the Jewish space laser as an obvious example. But there are so many examples of conspiracist themes that have somehow figured out, they've somehow learned, if we want to expand our circles further than they are in this direction rather than that direction, maybe we should stop talking or even vaguely gesturing in the direction of Jews. But I could be wrong about that. That might be just a current perception that will eventually, sadly, correct itself over time. Öcalan's work, I think, is a great example. The things that Blair and Chaya and Rob and other people focused on at that, when we did that workshop, were specifically the anti-Semitic elements in his book. But there's a whole host of other conspiracist elements in the exact same book that we didn't even address, a lot of which have absolutely no connection whatsoever to Jews or Jewishness or Jewish ideology, as he calls it. Now, I think it made sense that we were doing what we should have done in that particular case, but to be honest, it is possible to trace conspiracist lines and anti-Semitic lines in many different contexts, and they very frequently do end up converging, but I would say they don't always necessarily have to. Laura's question, wonderful question. False information to mislead the public. If you ask me, that is a pretty fair description of much of what we read in today's world, coming from an astonishing variety of sources, whether it's official government pronouncements or a corporation that's saying, we're going to change our name and change our ways. Whatever it's coming from, sadly, we live in a world that is absolutely chock full of intentional efforts to deceive and to mislead people. What I would argue is, what I would ask, let's put it that way, I would ask, what do we gain from applying a conspiracist lens to those occasions, and what do we lose from applying a conspiracist lens, as distinct from applying the sort of standard radical systemic structural critique that I was trying vaguely to argue for as an alternative? And I mean that as a real question. My own instincts obviously are that it's not going to get us anywhere to apply a conspiracist lens, but it is at least worth asking ourselves seriously. I don't know this particular Carr paper, the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right. I think that's a terrific outfit. I don't know this particular paper. I am very uninformed. I know a little bit about Dugin because I study the Dugins in Italy and Germany. But Russian disinformation, just like American disinformation and Czech disinformation, Hungarian disinformation and Japanese disinformation, that's very real. Those are very real parts of the social world that we live in. Abby's question, oh my gosh. Librarians are in a tough position right now. In a weird sense, speaking as a non-librarian who I absolutely depend on you all. No historian can do their work without librarians and archivists. I love the librarians that I work with around the world. Librarians, in a sense, have a professional obligation to try when they can to both give their clients as broad access as possible. The librarian's job is not supposed to be, I'm going to decide what information you get access to. And in some ways, right now, that professional responsibility is coming into direct conflict with the equally important obligation to try to steer people towards useful, relevant, meaningful, and possibly even truthful sources of information. And boy, that's a tough one. The way you put it, Abby, was sort of nudging people towards scholarly sources. I'm a college professor. I'm obviously okay with that, but I want to point out Most people in our society are not college professors. Half of our society, even just in a place like the United States, half of our society has never been to college, never will go to college. I think we want to be a little more, not you as librarians, we in general as left activists, we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about what exactly is the nature of the alternative sources that we're trying to get other people to grapple with. I have found excellent resources written in very non-academic prose in any number of online websites. Of course, there's terrible nonsense out there online, but it's possible to find resources that do not expect the user to have a degree in economics in order to be able to understand them. The extent to which that is addressing a symptom rather than a cause, you know, you're right, Abby, I would say that's unfortunately probably true. I don't know a way around that. If we're posing the question of the level of what information do we try to get into people's hands, that is almost by definition addressing the symptom. What I was trying to say, one of the more discouraging parts of my argument that I sort of buried a while back now is I don't think we are ever going to entirely get rid of conspiracism as an ongoing phenomenon until we radically transform the basic structures of our society. And I mean that when I say that. I think we're stuck with conspiracism for as long as we are stuck with a world built around the nation state, white supremacy, capitalism, and so forth. So really getting at the causes, that's asking a lot. We still have to ask it, we still have to push for it, but maybe in the meantime, we can also sometimes be okay with addressing some of the symptoms. Anne's question, I think they were asking about I think when I mentioned something like conscious calculation, that's what I was trying to get at in that part of the presentation. What I meant to say was that some conspiracist models depend on the notion that most of what happens in a society like ours is the result of deliberate acts that are done with a forethought and then the somehow clear-cut outcomes of those acts. I think the phrase I used was conscious calculated actions and their outcomes or consequences or something like that. What I meant to say there was, to a certain extent, that very notion, the notion that most of the important things that happen in a modern capitalist society like ours are indeed consciously chosen economic activities that we all freely engage in and walk into with perfect foresight and clearly foresee the consequences, and then those consequences actually happen. I think that's an ideology. I think that is a fantastically poor description of the actual reality of any capitalist and any statist society, but it's an ideology that comes from an interesting place. It's an ideology that any number of free market economists and ideologues and propagandists have tried to float versions of before. And I'm basically asking the rest of us not to fall for it, even though some folks would like us to think that the world actually operates according to the descriptions that Adam Smith laid out 200 and however many years ago. It does not, the world does not in fact operate that way. I think we should take much more seriously the notion that every single thing that every individual ever does in our lives, including in our private lives, including in the privacy of our own homes, I'm here at home in my study at home, everything that we do in a society like ours is constantly mediated through social structures and institutions over which we have extremely limited direct control. Until we change that, until we work toward a society in which everybody has at least some measure of participatory say over how our lives are structured, that is going to be a very salient fact of human existence. And it is essentially the opposite of the model in which we all do make conscious choices and actions, and those things then work out through their consequences and their outcomes and cause and effect, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so the next round we have, I'm not sure, I think Chris might have left actually, but we've got Chris, Tony about the Great Reset, Sebastian, HD, and I had a question myself I want to put on there. So Chris, I believe, left. I'll just do a quick, yeah, Chris is gone. So why don't we start with Tony's question about the Great Reset? Tony, are you still here with us? Scrolling down, we've got, I don't see Tony still here, but the question was essentially about the World Economic Forum and the idea of the Great Reset and if this qualifies as a conspiracy. Sebastian, you're still with us? Would you like to ask your question?
Awesome. Hi, my name is Sebastian. The first time in this doing one of these lessons, so I'm really excited. I guess my question is, what do you think about people of color falling into conspiracy theories? How can we get folks that might have a natural mistrust over the state and the system, capitalism, to get away from conspiracy theories and to take genuine critiques? I asked this question based off experience because as a Latino, my mom has fallen into conspiracy theories regarding COVID, and I'm currently labor organizing as well at a grocery store, and I've encountered customers, one being Black, who completely dismissed COVID as a hoax and stuff like that. And she has mentioned how the state has screwed her people over and stuff like that, like Tuskegee, the experiment and all those other things. And I had a horrible conversation, one because I was placed in a position of customer service, so I couldn't be as honest. But I think secondly, I mean, it was kind of tricky. How do I level with folks that have been historically oppressed? How do you get them out of that kind of conspiracy thinking? Because I really feel like it's a detriment to us as people of color, as minorities, that we fall into or potentially fall into conspiracy theories, and that allows white supremacists and stuff to just control the narrative.
Great question, Sebastian. Thank you. HD, you want to jump in there?
Hi. This entire conversation, particularly the answers you've given, have given me a lot of thought about how do we distinguish between conspiratorial thinking, conspiracy theory, in relation to misinformation, and just plain people being wrong about stuff in a way that is distinctly harmful. And I note not just in terms of things that people believe about, right-wing conspiracy theories and so on, but including on the left, there are often, especially and particularly around very contentious issues, that are very near and dear to a lot of people's heart, people care very deeply about. There's a lot of misinformation, lies by omission on a lot of very, very important topics that people fear that kind of going through the whole truth of it can perhaps leave a black stain, so to speak, on their argument, on their position, on whatever that may be, whether that are things around, for instance, within social ecology, obviously the topics many of us care deeply about include, the Black Lives Matter movement of the recent years, arguments about the origins of civilization and agriculture and its effect on humans and domestication and all that. Even things like colonialism, Jay Sakai comes to mind, things that people care very deeply about. And there are sometimes on a lot of different sides, arguments from misinformation, but may not necessarily be intended that way, much in the same way that most people who participate in conspiracy theories and have very similar effects are not necessarily intending to spread misinformation because they believe what they believe to be true, but there are still, through omissions and sometimes intentional and sometimes not, where is the boundary there? Where's the boundary there? But whether on the left or right, with things that people care about, this misinformation that many people spread, or misinformation or omission.
Okay, thanks, HD. Alex, why don't we hear your question? I'll throw mine in, and then we'll let Peter answer as he will. Alexander?
Sorry. Yes. I thought maybe there was another Alex, but yeah. My short question is related to some publications I've read on the topic, on the origin of disinformation and conspiracy thinking, sometimes more focused on disinformation, and pointing to the often neglected role of the libertarian movement and the right-wing free market fundamentalist libertarian movement. If I remember correctly, there's one publication called The Age of Disinformation from Cambridge University Press, and it actually focuses on libertarian entrepreneurs financing the world of the, groups like Steve Bannon, also relating it to climate denialism, and creating kind of this ecosystem in which disinformation, climate denialism gets mixed up with conspiracy thinking. And some of these publications are really, pointing to libertarianism as a major role in the current, conspiracy theories. So I was wondering what's your role on that? What's your view on the role of libertarianism? Yeah.
Thanks, Alexander. So I've got one I just wanted to ask. That's, one of the things that's been interesting about the current moment is the rise of conspirituality and this idea of conspiracy and alternative spiritualities, which we haven't talked too much about today. But what really jumps out for me is how prescient Murray Bookchin's critiques of these same trends were in the environmental movement and the anarchist movement, 20, 30 years ago. He was a harsh critic back then of New Age, of crystals, of astrology, of eco spiritualities, which a lot of people thought, okay, why is he so harsh on this? This just seems like, benign, maybe annoying, maybe whatever, but ultimately harmless. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because to me, many of those critiques seem absolutely prescient in terms of predicting the kind of like critique of rationality and embrace of irrationalism that we once associate, I guess, with the far right movements that's now kind of like spans both. And your thoughts on that? Okay, so we'll stop there. We'll let Peter answer, and then we'll hopefully have time for one more round before we wrap up.
Okay, awesome. The one question that I don't have a lot to say about, unfortunately, is the first one from Tony. I only have the vaguest familiarity with this recent notion of a great reset from, was it the last Davos meeting or 2 years ago? I'm not even clear on that. I know it's one of the recent ones. For what it's worth in general, I think we sometimes expend too much energy trying to make sense of stuff like what happens at Davos, what is the World Economic Forum. I don't say we should ignore those things, but my hunch is that most of the important decisions that very powerful capitalists and business leaders and thought leaders, as they like to call themselves now, God knows why, that sounds totally Stalinist to me, but that's the new term, thought leaders. I think most of the important decisions that those folks make are probably not going to be made at a Swiss ski resort. I think they're mostly made in the much more everyday, humdrum, what are our quarterly projections like for next year? What are we going to invest in? Who are we going to fire? How are we going to save? I think that's where the really important things about the future of world capitalism come from. Whereas a notion of a great reset, whatever they meant it to mean, I guess I'll wait and see. Maybe I'll be proven wrong in 5 years from now. It'll come out that actually that was a crucial place for these different sparring factions to come together and change the nature of the world. We'll see. Sebastian, wow, that is such a fantastic question. Thank you for sharing it with me for reasons that we won't go into. For those of you who know me and know who I live with, I struggle with the same questions a lot in my own personal life. I'm a white guy, but those are really important questions. Your mom's right. Tuskegee was real. She's not imagining that stuff. That's one of the problems here. If we stick to the level of trying to debunk particular conspiracy theories, this one's wrong, that fact is wrong, we get sucked into this thing where they can come right back and say, but Tuskegee, dude, that actually happened. Yeah, unfortunately, sadly, tragically, that did happen. The argument that I sometimes try to sneak in there, and it totally depends, I'm sure you know this yourself, It depends on like tactical considerations about who am I talking to, where and when, and who else is around. But the argument that I try to slip into those discussions with comrades of color or in-laws of color or what have you is that if we settle for a model that explains these things, that just pins the blame onto some group, whether it's a small group or a big group that's been operating behind the scenes, and then we didn't learn about it until 40 years afterwards. If we stop there, what we are doing is leaving the systemic causes unaddressed. And my hunch in situations like that is that a whole lot of people of color, depending on where they live, if they live in a place like Milwaukee, where I live, they're probably going to be pretty used to the systemic nature of racial hierarchy and exploitation. And if you can try to sort of nudge that thought into their minds and try to ask them to recognize, if you're really worried about the systemic and structural causes, it takes us directly away from that to instead look at a small group working behind the scenes that has been, pulling a fast one on the rest of us. But boy, that's a tough question. Maybe if you're interested later on, we can try to talk more pointedly and concretely about it. HD, absolutely. Sometimes we're just wrong about stuff. I'm wrong about stuff like 98% of the time, and that's a problem and embarrassing because I teach young people, and it's just part of being a human being. I didn't mean to let myself off the hook there, but it's true. Human beings are fallible. We get stuff wrong all the time, even when we are trying our best, trying our level best with the best will in the world. We process information wrong. We get bad, partial, faulty, flawed information to start with, and then it gets processed through our minds, et cetera, et cetera. I think Laura brought up an important part of that question that I unfortunately forgot to address in the last round about the frequency with which liberals denounce and dismiss what they take to be conspiracy thinkings. I have experienced that myself. I grew up in a family of liberals, my mom and dad, and not all, but most of my siblings. I can't tell you the number of times that my beloved mother used to say to me, I'd make some extremely banal point about the way the state actually works, and she would wave it aside with her hand and say, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. It was nothing like a conspiracy. It had none of the elements of a conspiracy theory, but to her, from her liberal mindset, it sure seemed like a conspiracy theory because it was too extreme and too radical. That's one of the problems that we're wrestling with here. When we fall into arguments from unrecognized false premises, not because we're trying to, not because we're trying to deceive anybody, because we've essentially inadvertently deceived ourselves, I'm not sure there is a really clear boundary there. My argument is not that any of the conspiracists on the left broadly construed, that I have been talking about, my argument is not that they are driven by malicious motives. As far as I can tell, they're virtually always driven by the same motives that the rest of us are. They want to stop bad things happening. They want to change the world in a better direction. The problem is not the conscious and subjective state of mind. I think the problem is at least one level deeper. What are the basic assumptions we bring to trying to understand a society like at least the one that I live in, and that I think a lot of the people participating here today live in as well. Alex, the role of libertarians. Yeah, freaking Rand Paul, Peter Thiel. How do we say his name in English? Do people say Thiel? That guy. The ways in which climate denialism very easily slides into conspiracy thinking. That stuff is 100% true. My one note of caution would be, I don't want to be so quick to let those capital L libertarians steal the term libertarian from us, from libertarian leftists, from anti-authoritarian leftists, because when you think about it, what shred of actual libertarianism could possibly be left on that model? These are people who lined up behind Donald Trump, who doesn't have a single libertarian bone in his body, who is a forthrightly authoritarian version of right-wing thinking. I think the capital L libertarians have sort of finally given up even the pretense of following those notions. What they haven't given up on is a proprietarian approach, a market-based society where what you own decides how much you decide, how big a role you have in shaping society. And that is something we need to address head on and try to show why that society will never, ever be in the interests of anything more than a tiny minority of particularly fortunate and wealthy people. Blair's question last. Of course, Murray was very ahead of the curve on a lot of those issues, even though some of us argued against him in some ways back then in the 80s and 90s. Some of the critiques that he brought up of alternative forms of spirituality that are especially predominant among countercultural milieus, in his case in North American context, but this also applies to Germany and Italy, at least the other places where I spend my time, that stuff was often very much on target. I think we could also profitably, that's a terrible capitalist metaphor. Why did I just say that? We could also, to our benefit, draw on some of the feminist critiques of New Age spiritualities and alternative spiritualities. We don't have to just stick to what Murray Bookchin was saying in the 1980s and 1990s, but yeah, he was onto something. I don't know that conspiracism is necessarily endemic in those milieus, but there's sure a very common historical pattern of if you meet a dyed-in-the-wool full-on New Age person, you're not going to be surprised if it comes out 5 minutes later that, yes, they believe in any number of different conspiracy theories. I think there's enough of a similarity in general outlooks that helps to sustain that unfortunate pattern. Do we still have time for a couple more if I shut up now?
Sure. I mean, I want to also give you a chance to make any final comments, and I just want to close up a bit, but Paula had a question about religion, and then Isaac had a question. So maybe we could take those real quick. You can answer those and we could do a quick wrap up.
Awesome.
Paula, you want to jump in? I could also just read it. When you talk about conspiracy theorists needing to have a cause for any disparate events in the world, I immediately think of religions. How do you view religions, which may well have been conspiracy theories that took hold in societies over time? How can we know there's difference? Isaac, you want to jump in with yours if you're still here?
Yeah, sure. I was typing it out, but I didn't get finished. So I guess what I'm thinking about conspiracy theories here is concerning how they spread. And so, you know, love him or hate him, Richard Dawkins at least came up with an interesting word, the word meme, to think about how ideas spread in a way that might be similar to genes. And so I think it's interesting to look at conspiracy theories as like ideas that are good at spreading, that people tend to latch onto and can be difficult to displace. And the reason they spread is simply because, you know, they have these characteristics to them that make them easy for people to latch onto in the kind of difficult society we live in. So I guess I'm just thinking, what do you think of that kind of analysis of why conspiracy theories spread?
All right, Peter, we'll let you answer those and wrap up.
And then we'll wrap it up. You bet. Paula's question, religions, in my view, are essentially the historical descendant of long ago versions of the same kind of thinking, the same kind of mentality or outlook that I was trying to diagnose in the first half of my talk. When we encounter seemingly inexplicable events, which, guess what, happens constantly throughout human evolutionary history, possibly happened more 100,000 years ago than today, although I'm not sure about that. But that is an absolutely common experience for every human being who's ever walked the planet. When we encounter these events that we just don't have, given our previously existing mental frameworks, we just don't have a good explanation for them. It's very tempting to posit there must be some external force out there, whether it's God or Satan or the devil or a panoply of divine forces or what have you. It's an extremely tempting thought. I happen to be an atheist, so I am generally unmoved by such theories, but you can absolutely see where the urge to come up with that kind of explanation is going to come from. I do think that the sorts of conspiracist social explanations that I was talking to, I do think they fall into a little bit of a different category. You're not trying to explain why did lightning just strike. You're more trying to explain why does the world economy seem to be getting more and more unequal instead of more equal. Things like that invite a specific kind of supposedly clear-cut cause and effect logic that has to attribute an agent force to some individual or some group that, in fact, according to a structural analysis, very often lacks that sort of agency entirely. Isaac's question is a terrific question to end on. How do conspiracy theories spread? The only trouble I have with Dawkins' notion of a meme, which has become a meme, which has taken on a life of its own, it's kind of funny and ironic. My general objection is the same as my objection to the rest of Dawkins' thought. I think it amounts to a kind of tautology. It's a way of saying successful memes are memes that are successful at spreading themselves. That's how we know that they have succeeded. It's, if you ask me, it collapses at a philosophical level, but I'm probably not the best person to ask. He's at the polar end of the evolutionary theorists that I respect and learn from are his major critics. So I probably would say that. Nonetheless, you're onto something. When you say that conspiracist theories are really good at spreading, that part, unfortunately, I have to agree on. And what I want to ask us is, why is that the case? And I think we can actually offer some answers. We can say conspiracy theories are sexy. They have a colorful cast of characters. Those characters have names. Even in the conspiracy theories where we haven't figured out who their names are yet, oh, we know they have names. They have faces, they have personalities, they have plot lines. You could make a great movie, and people have made great movies out of conspiracy theories. Try making a movie out of the radical social critique systemic argument that I tried to posit as the alternative. No one would ever go see that movie. It would be boring as anything you can imagine. That's a problem, but we have to be honest with ourselves. The kinds of stories that I want to offer to left audiences, to radical audiences, to people involved in grassroots social movements, the kinds of stories that I want to offer are never going to be as sexy, as colorful, as exciting, as plot-driven as the conspiracist alternatives. And there's a reason for that. My whole argument is that those sexy, colorful, plot-driven stories much of the time utterly fail to grasp the way so much of a statist and capitalist and white supremacist and patriarchal society actually functions. The difficulty is we have to find ways of making those alternative theoretical constructs more accessible to people who are going to their local librarian, to go back to Abby's question, and trying to figure out what the hell is going on in our society, but people who are not otherwise immersed in Marxism and anarchism and communalism and feminism and everything else. I unfortunately don't have great ideas exactly how we should do that, but I think we all need to admit that we eventually need to do that. If we want to compete, if there were a free marketplace of ideas, which there isn't, and we were trying to compete against the conspiracy stories, we've got some work to do to make our alternative models at least somewhat more approachable for people from a much broader walks of life. I think that's it for my wrap up, if that's okay with folks. This has been an absolutely tremendous discussion. I'm sorry that I missed a lot of what went on in the chat. We'll see when when the rest of you go away, Blair and I maybe will have a chance to go back over some of it. Thank you to everybody for participating here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thanks to everyone else for taking time out of your day to participate in this really important conversation. We did record it. It's going to go up on our YouTube channel here very shortly, hopefully by the end of the day. I just shared the link. We've got 2 upcoming classes that I mentioned. One, Commune Council Party, Marxism and Direct Democracy, that starts in mid-December. And then we've got another one, Food and Climate Justice, that starts in January. Peter's book, Ecology Contested, is out now, so you should check it out. It's got great stuff on the Unabomber, on Disney ecology, on ambiguities of animal rights, on ecofascism revisited, etc. Fantastic book. Thank you so much, Peter, for hosting this conversation with us, and stay tuned, everybody, and have a good afternoon, good day. Thanks so much.